Part 2. The Ten Commandments and the Mosaic Law. 25. Points to God's authority versus pointed to Christ's mission. Ten Commandments shows who God is, Exodus 22. Mosaic Law, symbols of Christ, Hebrews 10:1. Illustration, King's seal versus prophecy scroll. 26. Existed before Sinai versus given at Sinai. Ten Commandments. Cain sinned before Sinai, Genesis 4:7. Mosaic Law, given after Exodus, Exodus 19-20. Illustration, older building foundation versus new extension. 27. Required by all disciples versus not required for Gentile converts. Ten Commandments, binding for all, Romans 3:31. Mosaic Law, not required for Gentiles, Acts 15:28-29. Illustration, core training versus advanced elective. 28. The law of liberty versus yoke of bondage. Ten Commandments, called liberty, James 2:12. Mosaic Law, called a yoke, Acts 15:10. Illustration, freedom in truth versus heavy burden. 29. Jesus obeyed it perfectly versus Jesus ended the need for it. Ten Commandments, Jesus obeyed, John 15:10. Mosaic Law, fulfilled and removed, Ephesians 2:15. Illustration, champion runner versus completed race. 30. God's voice was heard by all versus only Moses heard, Mosaic Law. Ten Commandments, all heard, Deuteronomy 5:22. Mosaic Law, Moses alone heard, Exodus chapter 34:27-28. Illustration, public address versus private briefing. 31. Cannot be nailed to the cross versus Mosaic Law. Was nailed, Ten Commandments, eternal, Luke 16:17. Mosaic Law, nailed to cross, Colossians 2:14. Illustration, unmovable foundation versus cancelled debt. 32. Love fulfills it versus law of ordinances, replaced Ten Commandments, fulfilled by love, Romans 13:10. Mosaic Law, replaced by grace, Hebrews 7:18-19. Illustration, love in action versus checklist replaced. 33. Blessings for obedience versus curses for disobedience. Ten Commandments, brings life, Proverbs 3:1-2. Mosaic Law, brings curse, Galatians 3:10. Illustration, fruitful tree versus thorny path. 34. Eternal foundation of God's throne versus temporary guardian. Ten Commandments, basis of God's rule, Psalm 89:14. Mosaic Law, guardian until Christ, Galatians 3:24-25. Illustration, permanent court versus temporary tutor. 35. Part of God's covenant of grace versus old covenant. Ended Ten Commandments, written on hearts, Hebrews 10:16. Mosaic Law, old covenant ended, Hebrews 8:13. Illustration, heart tattoo versus paper document. 36. Identifies love to God and man versus rituals and symbols. Ten Commandments, love God and neighbor, Matthew 22:37-40. Mosaic Law, ritual-focused, Hebrews 9:10. Illustration, relationship versus religious formality. 37. Spoken by God in fire versus taught by Moses in peace. Ten Commandments, thunder, fire, trumpet, Exodus 20:18. Mosaic Law, taught calmly, Leviticus 1:1. Illustration, fireworks versus classroom. 38. Jesus repeats and reinforces them versus Jesus ends, Mosaic Law, Ten Commandments, repeated by Jesus, Matthew 19:17-19. Mosaic Law, ended in Christ, Romans 10:4. Illustration, rebuilds house versus finishes temple. 39. God's eternal will versus Israel's civil constitution. Ten Commandments, God's will, Psalm 48. Mosaic Law, Israel's civil code, Exodus 21-24. Illustration: Supreme Law versus City Law. 40. Testifies against all humanity versus testified against Israel. 10 Commandments. All are guilty. Romans 3:19. Mosaic Law. Witness against Israel. Deuteronomy 31:26. Illustration: Universal Courtroom versus Tribal Council. 41. Holy and just and good versus weak through flesh. 10 Commandments. Romans 7:12. Mosaic Law. Romans 8:3. Illustration: Golden Pillar versus Fragile Tent. 42. A delight to the righteous versus a burden to the wicked. 10 Commandments. Psalm 119:97. Mosaic Law. Galatians 5:1. Illustration: Treasure map versus maze. 43. Perfect law of liberty versus schoolmaster to Christ. 10 Commandments. James 1:25. Mosaic Law. Galatians chapter 3:24. Illustration: Freedom compass versus training wheels. 44. Not done away by faith versus replaced by Christ. 10 Commandments. Romans 3:31. Mosaic Law. Hebrews 10:9. Illustration: Cement versus blueprint replaced. 45. Originated from love versus originated for correction. 10 Commandments. Based on love. Matthew 22:40. Mosaic Law. Added for transgressions. Galatians 3:19. Illustration: Love letter versus warning note. 46. Still binding in new covenant versus no longer binding. 10 Commandments. Hebrews 8:10. Mosaic Law. Hebrews 8:13. Illustration: Eternal flame versus extinguished candle. 47. Preached by apostles versus not required by apostles. 10 Commandments. Romans 13:8-10. Mosaic Law. Acts 15:24-29. Illustration: Moral compass versus lifted burden. 48. Foundation of judgment versus temporary regulation. 10 Commandments. Ecclesiastes 12:13-14. Mosaic Law. Colossians 2:14. Illustration: Court verdict versus traffic signs removed. 49. Guides. Christian living versus served as tutor. 10 Commandments. Matthew 19:17. Mosaic Law. Galatians 3:24-25. Illustration: Path of life versus school curriculum. 50. To be kept forever versus ended at the cross. 10 Commandments. Psalm 111:7-8. Mosaic Law. Ephesians 2:15. Illustration: Eternal bridge versus completed detour.